If you're willing, come closer and let me tell you a story. Not one taken from an old book, but one that feels as though it could have been written in the salt on a sailor's sleeve and the ink of a mapmaker's trembling hand. It is the tale of a journey to uncharted lands, the kind of journey that begins with a small decision and ends with a person no longer quite the same as when they started. It began in a harbor city where gulls argued over scraps and the sea smelled of metal and rain. The docks were always alive. Ropes creaked, lanterns swung, merchants shouted, and the tide tugged at ships as if impatient to be gone. In a narrow street near the waterfront lived a young cartographer named Elias, one of those people who loved lines more than crowds and questions more than answers. His room was a cluttered nest of parchment, ink pots, compasses, half-finished charts, and bits of driftwood that he swore looked like coastlines if you turned them the right way. Elias worked for the Harbor Guild, drawing maps that made merchants feel safe. He charted familiar routes, named familiar capes, and traced the same dependable coastlines again and again. But the maps he made by day were not the maps he dreamed of by night. In his dreams, the edges of the world were not neat borders. They were torn pages. They were invitations. On one particular evening, when the sky was bruised purple and the tide was higher than usual, an old sailor came into the map shop where Elias worked. The man's beard was knotted like rope, and his hands were stained with pitch. He smelled of smoke and deep water. Without speaking at first, he laid something on the counter, a piece of sea-worn wood, carved with symbols that looked like letters and waves at the same time. Elias leaned forward, fascinated. "Where did you find this?" The sailor's eyes glittered. "Somewhere the sea doesn't like to speak of," he said. His voice was rough but not unkind. "Far past the shipping lanes, past the storms that swallow compasses, past the places where maps end and guesses begin." Elias's heart gave a careful, excited beat. "You mean beyond the known charts?" The sailor nodded. Then, very slowly, he placed a second item on the counter, an old vellum scrap, yellowed and torn, with ink so faded it looked like it had been written in shadow. On it was a partial coastline drawn in a style Elias had never seen. Sharp angles and flowing curves woven together like a secret. Near the edge of the parchment, a phrase had been written in a careful hand. "When the moon is a thin silver nail, follow the star that does not move." Elias stared. He had seen hundreds of maps. He had studied the work of masters and the scrawls of amateurs. But this felt different. It felt like a door left slightly open. "Why show this to me?" Elias asked, voice suddenly soft. The sailor's gaze held him. "Because you still believe there's something more, and because you can read what others won't." He tapped the vellum with one thick finger. "The guild won't touch it. Merchants don't pay for dreams. But dreams," he added, leaning closer, "are sometimes the only compass worth trusting." That night, Elias could not sleep. The torn map fragment lay on his desk, and the carved driftwood seemed to hum with a silent rhythm, as if still remembering the ocean. He studied the phrase again and again. "The star that does not move." He knew it at once. The North Star, a steady eye in the sky. The moon as a thin silver nail, that meant a narrow crescent, a specific night. A journey then, not just any journey, a timed journey, one that had to begin under the right sky. Now there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who find comfort in certainty, and there are those who find certainty suffocating. Elias had been pretending to be the first kind for years, but the truth was he had always been the second. By morning, he had made his choice. He resigned from the Harbor Guild, to the stunned disbelief of his supervisors. He sold a few books he loved, which felt like selling pieces of himself, and used the money to buy supplies: dried food, water barrels, oil for lanterns, warm cloth, rope, and a weathered compass, though he suspected it might become more decoration than tool. And most importantly, he found a ship. It wasn't a grand ship. It wasn't the kind of ship that made a crowd admire it. It was small, sturdy, and scarred, the sort of ship that looked like it had survived things it refused to describe. Its name, painted in flaking blue letters on the side, was the Wren. The captain was a woman named Captain Mara, with wind-burned skin and eyes that measured everything without rushing. She listened to Elias's request without laughing, which was already a promising sign. "Uncharted Lands," she repeated, as if tasting the words. "That's what people call mistakes before they become legends." Elias swallowed. "I have a map fragment and a clue." Mara studied the vellum scrap in silence. Then she looked up at the sky, where the clouds moved like slow ships. "If we're going," she said, "we go with a crew that understands silence. People who don't panic when the sea decides to be strange." She gathered a small crew, only 5 besides herself and Elias. There was June, the navigator, who had a calm face and a mind that worked like a clock. There was Sella, the carpenter, whose hands could coax life out of dead wood. There was Bram, a quiet sailor with a scar across his jaw, who seemed to listen more to waves than words. There was Nico, young and restless, who laughed too loudly as if daring fear to catch him. And there was old Tamsin, the cook, whose eyes were soft but her voice could cut through chaos like a knife through rope. On the night the moon became a thin silver nail, the Wren slipped out of the harbor like a secret leaving town. At first, the sea was almost kind. The ship rocked gently, and the crew fell into a rhythm of work and watch. Elias stood at the stern often, staring back at the shrinking lights of the city, feeling the familiar world loosen its grip on him. He was afraid, but it was the clean kind of fear that comes with stepping into something larger than yourself. They followed the North Star, as the message instructed. For days the sky was clear enough for it to shine like a steady promise. Elias kept a careful log: wind patterns, wave direction, cloud formations, anything that might become a line on a map later. The crew teased him kindly for writing down things most sailors simply felt in their bones, but they did not stop him. They seemed to understand that his notebook was not just paper, it was his anchor. On the 7th day, the sea changed. It began subtly. The waves grew strangely smooth, as if the ocean had become thick glass. The wind died, not in a natural calming, but as if someone had closed a door. Even the gulls vanished. The Wren's lantern light became a pale bubble in endless gray. Voices seemed to travel oddly, bending and returning. Bram tied ropes along the deck, so no one would lose their way from one end of the ship to the other. Elias held the torn map fragment in his pocket like a talisman. He could feel the paper damp against his skin, as if the fog itself wanted to erase it. As the fog deepened, the sea began to whisper, not with words, no, not quite, but with tones that sounded like distant singing, and sometimes like someone calling your name from far away. Nico, pale and sweating, swore he heard his mother's voice. Sella said she heard hammering, like a ship being built. June heard nothing and looked terrified by that. Mara stood at the bow, narrowing her eyes, and said, "No one answers, no one speaks back. Whatever it is, it's trying to hook your mind like a fish." They held to that rule. gripping ropes, clenching teeth, letting the strange sounds wash over them without response. Elias felt something tugging at his thoughts, memories rising unexpectedly, regrets whispering in his ear, images of homes so vivid he could smell bread baking in the cottage street where he had once lived as a child. He squeezed his eyes shut and focused on the one thing that could not be argued with, the steady pressure of the rope in his hand. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fog thinned. The wren drifted out into open air, and there, straight ahead, was something that made every breath catch in every chest. A coastline. Not a familiar one, not a line that matched any chart Elias had ever copied. It rose from the sea like a secret finally deciding to show its face. Tall cliffs of black stone that glittered faintly as if threaded with metal. Waterfalls poured from high places into the ocean in long white ribbons. Above the cliffs, forests swayed, with trees of pale leaves that looked almost silver in the sun. When the wind moved through them, it made a soft chiming sound, like distant bells. Nico whispered, "It's like the trees are singing." "Quiet," Mara warned, but her voice was softer now, almost respectful. They walked inland, leaving the beach behind. The ground rose gently, strange flowers grew in clusters, deep blue petals with white veins that glowed faintly when shadow passed over them. Tiny insects hovered above, their wings reflecting light like shards of glass. Then Bram halted abruptly, raising a hand. Ahead, half hidden among roots and ferns, lay stone ruins, not huge, not towering, but